Tonight, Northern Ireland has been brought to a standstill, and for what? Thousands of public sector workers were on strike today, but are they being listened to? We'll assess the fallout from the industrial action and what the union's next move could be. Plus, the latest in our series of voices from those working on the front line.
We have a waiting list today that 10 years ago we would have been horrified at. Politicians know what they should be doing. They need to find a way to actively do it.
And if Stormont is to remain on ice, how might this place be governed in the future? Is Plan B now the only way forward? Hello, it's been a long, cold day for tens of thousands of public sector workers who took to picket lines across the country to demand a pay rise from a Secretary of State who says he's powerless to help, even though he's admitted the money to meet the request is available. With just over an hour of the strike to go, has today's action moved the dial at all in terms of persuading Chris Heaton-Harris to act? I'm joined now by Davy Thompson, Deputy Regional Secretary of the Unite Union. Carmel Gates is General Secretary of NIPSA. And also with us is the former Permanent Secretary in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, Dr. Andrew McCormick. Welcome to all of you, and thanks very much for joining us tonight. Carmel Gates, first of all, do you regard today's strike as a success?
Oh, it's been a tremendous success, Mark. We've had over 150,000 workers on picket lines today, all in good voice, all in good form, and we've had tremendous support from the public. And so 20% of the employed workforce in Northern Ireland were on strike today, and that is a significant event in anybody's book, and I believe it has been a wonderful success. OK,
so you're happy with the turnout, you're happy with the support you got from the public, but here's the question. Are you even one step closer to achieving your goal of delivering a pay rise for your members?
Well, I think every step that workers have taken has brought us that wee bit closer. We started action a year ago, and a year ago Heaton-Harris had just imposed his sanctions budget, and at that point in time there was nothing on the table. I think the action that we have taken has moved him to the position where there is a pot of money for pay for public sector workers, and there is a pot of money for here that is better than we might otherwise have got.
Yeah, but he says he can't release it. He wasn't in Northern Ireland today. You're not any closer to actually getting that money distributed to your members. That's the point. If that's the goal, you're nowhere nearer now than you were this time yesterday.
And it's quite a confusing message that's coming out, because one arm of government is saying the money's there and the other arm of government saying you're not getting it, and it's just unacceptable. I believe that he has the power to repurpose the money, to give it across. I think he's digging in, and he's still using workers as pawns in an attempt to get the DUP back into government. It is unacceptable. He is allowing the fabric to be torn out of services here. He's allowing public sector workers are hemorrhaging out of our service and they're moving to other parts of these islands and further abroad. So there's going to be very little left unless he acts soon, and I think there's an imperative on him now to do that. I think workers have shown that we're not prepared to take it anymore. We are prepared for further action. There will be escalation. Our members are up for it. We've promised it. And we believe now the public are clamouring to join the action. We know that because they've spoken to us, they've told us, and they're with us.
David Thompson, what did you hope today would achieve?
Well, we hope to try and move the political establishment to sit down and look at this seriously. Whilst we have a Stormont government, and maybe people in Northern Ireland are becoming used to that. We've only had government for 2 years in the last 7, effectively. But we need to move forward with the Secretary of State. We need to move forward with the British government. They need to step in and support it. Our public services are on the cliff edge here. And if they tip over, there's no pulling them back after that there. So there needs to be someone to step in. Treasury needs to step in, support the money, support the appropriate money to go in. Maybe a bit more than 3.3 billion, to be honest with you, but to support the appropriate money to go in, to support our service, to give people pay raise that they absolutely deserve. Some of our members haven't had pay raises in 3 years, going through the worst cost of living. These were exactly the people who were critical to this company during a pandemic, and now they're just being ignored.
So there's about an hour left, an hour and 10 or 12 minutes of this strike action to go. And you've both stated the case that you've been stating for days, weeks and months. I just wonder where the evidence is that the Secretary of State, Chris Heaton-Harris, who controls the purse strings, is listening and has been moved to act. Can you point to any evidence at all that Chris Heaton-Harris's mind is changing on this issue, that he's softening?
Mark,
or are you just going to grind him down?
Mark, what I would suggest was you look at the evidence. The unions have called for three things throughout this: pay, a sustainable budget going forward, and investment in the infrastructure in this country. In December, the Secretary of State miraculously found 3.3 billion, and that was the three items on the table. Exactly the three items that the trade unions have been calling for the past year.
But you still haven't got the pay settlement that today's strike was about.
No, we haven't. And maybe next week when he does his legislation, he put it in the legislation to allow that to happen. Let's see what happens.
OK. Andrew McCormick, you've been around the block and you've been a very senior civil servant and you've had lots of conversations with government ministers and with trade union leaders and business leaders through the years. You were nodding your head during a lot, I noticed out of the corner of my eye, presumably in agreement with a lot of what Carmel Gates and Davy Thompson have just said. Do you think, looking at the evidence, that the dial has been moved at all after today's strike action?
I can't see that. I wish I could.
You can't see it?
He's taken a position which, as Carmel said, is completely unacceptable. I've been commenting on that since it was first announced in the middle of December. It's a tactical move linked to the discussions with the DUP on the Windsor framework.
So it's a calculated political move on the part of the Secretary of State.
For him now to change his tactics will look really strange.
OK, and when Carmel talked about workers being used as pawns by the Secretary of State, I definitely saw you nodding.
Yes, well, that's precisely what he's doing. It's illegitimate, it's unreasonable. It's a complete failure of responsibility on his part. OK,
so if it is illegitimate and unreasonable now at 10 to 11 on Thursday night, and if it has been illegitimate and unsustainable all along, where's the suggestion that he's about to change tack?
Well, I can't see that, and I wish I could. He really should. There is also a need for the position with the DUP to be resolved. He says the talks are finished with them. Why isn't that called in some way, either by him putting on the table what's been agreed, or something happening in the DUP? That's also what has to break. Otherwise, this situation is going to continue, and it absolutely shouldn't. OK, you appeared on Talkback yesterday. I just want to ask you about this with the economist, Dr. Esmond Birney from Ulster University, who, in his view, said the public sector workers' strike today would be immoral. That was, and he then went on to justify that would be the case because he said that the public services would suffer and there would be a cost to the Northern Ireland economy. Does he have a point? I mean, there may be some people who listen to that conversation who look at today's strike action and do think that this is not the right tack. If public services are under real pressure, if hospital waiting lists are very bad, if there are real problems in our education sector, the last thing we need is to pile yet more pressure on that very difficult scenario by strike action. I think there's an understandable point there, and a few callers to talk about today made that point. But the situation is so extreme, so unusual, that it's very hard to see what else could happen. This is what happens when no one takes responsibility. I used the word anarchy yesterday.
You did.
Which is a very big word, and we're not at anarchy. But
you said we're nearly there.
No. The word means no government.
Yes.
We have no government.
Yeah.
Disorder is the result. If you want to avoid anarchy, then stop now and act, intervene, take responsibility. That means either Chris Heaton-Harris stepping up and taking decisions. He said himself, pay is a very political issue. That's what he said in the Commons yesterday. Or we need the DUP to come in and realise that this is more important, actually what's happening, the collapse of public services, the issues across what's going on are really critically important and need to be addressed now.
So what you're saying, just to be absolutely clear, is that if we don't deal with this situation and deal with it properly and quickly, we are looking at anarchy in Northern Ireland?
Not in the sense of massive street disorder, but we have already...
Your definition of anarchy was no government.
Exactly. That's what the word means,
yeah.
Actually. But we risk an ongoing attrition of public services. I was in charge of the health service 10 years ago. I thought things were difficult then. They're incredibly worse now. And that's part of what is unacceptable, part of what is just so wrong, and why this needs to be resolved immediately.
The head of the civil service, Jane Brady, was on the picket line today. Was that the right thing for her to do, in your view? Should she have been there?
I think there is a situation now, an unusual situation, different to what was 20 years ago when I was across the table from Carmel disagreeing with her, where it's so important that the leaders in the civil service at the moment recognise that what's going on is unique, it's unprecedented, it needs to be resolved, and to be supportive. They are supportive of the pay awards being made. They've written seeking clarity, because if they don't have planning decisions now, almost immediately, then things are going to get even worse than they are.
What do you do tomorrow, Carmel Gates? You've just heard a former senior civil servant describe the approach of the current Secretary of State as unsustainable and effectively indefensible. But you've got to go back into talks. Presumably, you've got to try to persuade this individual, who so far has not listened to the case that you have made, that he needs to change his approach. How do you do that? Where do you go from here? And at what point do you say we're going to consider further strike action? Well,
next week, I'm hoping that I'm going to be sitting down with senior civil servants to see what it is that they can produce in terms of a budget, and whether or not they have had any more word from him about what's happening. And then after that, our executive will have to seriously consider where we go next. I'll be meeting with groups of workers, potentially selective action. As you know, Mark, I was here talking to you about when we closed the ports and the meat plants. Those are drastic steps that we don't want to have to take again. But if we're not being listened to, then we don't have a choice. And we are prepared to ramp it up. And all of our members are ready to do that, because they are absolutely at their wits' end. And if all we can do is withdraw our labour, then that's what we have to do.
But do you think that you would have public support for doing that? I mean, there is the law of diminishing returns. Every time you take action, the impact is potentially reduced and the public support falls off. It's a risky strategy. And, of course, workers who are complaining about not being paid enough would also be losing out on pay.
I think people can see how desperate things are. You only have to listen to any of the people who contributed to any of the news programmes today to see how desperate they are about the services they're in. And let's look back. Health service workers were criticised in 2019 when they took to picket lines. Now, that resulted then in the Assembly being forced to come back. And as a result of that, they won a pay award and they won parity that kept some from hemorrhaging out of the service. If our action can do that again, and I wonder if that's what the Secretary of State is hoping, that will bring the DUP back to the table. But we're in a very different political circumstance than we were then, and I think that he needs to recognise that the onus is on him to make the money available. We'll be putting more pressure on him. I'll be seeking another meeting with him. The meeting that I had with him previously, I think, helped to let him see that the pay awards for public servants has to be the top of the agenda. Unfortunately, he has not made the money available to do that yet.
Yeah, and he doesn't appear to be listening to that argument. Are you worried about the law of diminishing returns? I mean, you've got members in various sectors across Northern Ireland. Do you want to see this place being brought to a standstill again, as it was today? And do you think the public would welcome that, would support that?
We're very clear. This is somewhere we don't want to be. This is somewhere we could have been last year in April when we didn't get pay raises. We tried to work through the process, but we've come to crunch point. And sometimes the media portrays this as the public out there versus public sector workers. Everybody in this country are public. They are the public. That's it. People say about, well, they can't get buses, can't they? Our members' families can't get buses. So every person is impacted by this. We believe at this point in time, we have the public support because they see and they witness day and daily the damage that is being done to our public services. You know, you talked earlier about the stresses put in the system. Our members know the stresses they're going back to, but they also know that it's because of underfunding over the last decade or more that has brought the main pressures onto them at this point, which has forced them to go where they are today.
Yeah, I mean, the public isn't a single entity, and you would have heard lots of people on the airwaves today clearly supporting the action of public sector workers.
And I accept there is people,
but there are also people who've been critical of it, and we heard them today phoning into radio programmes saying they're very unhappy about it.
Absolutely.
So my point is that could build a head of steam, and there could be people who are, increasingly unhappy about future action.
Well,
But
Mark,
you're saying you're not worried about
Mark, I'm not saying we're not worried, because we understand the damage it does to it. We're trade unions.
Yeah.
And we have our battles. But we all want to see Northern Ireland flourish. Yeah. We all want to see the economy grow. We all want to be at our work ensuring that's what happens and makes it happen.
Okay.
And we need the support of a British government to step in and make that happen.
A quick one, Carmel Gates, on this, because the focus has been on the Secretary of State, Chris Heaton-Harris, and that's the person who was in the firing line as far as the unions were concerned today. And that was very clear from all of the statements that came out in advance of today's action. That raised a few eyebrows in certain quarters, and some people said, why don't you call out the DUP? Because there is clearly an argument that the DUP could sort this out very quickly by simply saying, we're going to end our boycott of Stormont, we're going to go back. Chris Heaton-Harris then has made it very clear that he would release the money that would broadly settle the pay claim that you have on the table. Why not criticise the DUP?
Well, Mark, I don't believe that the money that has been set out for public sector pay awards is enough to settle them. I think we're probably about 100 million short. So that is the reality of where we are. So if the DUP are holding out for more money, then, you know, it's hard to ask them to go back with a package that may mean that we're in battle with them, with Sinn Féin and all the other politicians.
Sorry, hang on. Are you saying that the DUP, you're prepared to see the DUP as an ally in your fight to get this money from Chris Heaton-Harris? Because there are clearly other people who see it very differently and think that it's the DUP's intransigence, as they would see it, that's actually preventing you getting that money.
I'm hoping that all of our politicians are allies in increasing the money that's available, because what we know, and I think what they know, is that although there may be money to partially settle some pay claims now, there isn't the recurrent funding that we need going forward. There isn't the baseline funding. There isn't money for a needs-based budget. That's what's needed. So I think all of our politicians probably understand that they've probably done the sums and maybe have worked out that there isn't enough money there. And I would want them all to be going back to Treasury and saying, we don't want to be back in a year's time with workers on picket lines again, only this time our anger will be towards the local politicians who are telling us that they're making pay cuts. OK. Andrew McCormick, you're going to stay with us and we're going to talk to you about where we go from here, or what the options are from here. But can I just ask you to respond to what you've heard from Carmel Gates? There will be people who will be maybe surprised to hear a union leader saying that the DUP might actually be playing this right in terms of getting more money from the Secretary of State, rather than saying the boycott needs to end, go back into Stormont, do your job, and that will release the funds that we need to pay our workers the money that we think they deserve.
I can see what Carmel's saying, and there's a point. If you work within that, in the tactical box that the Secretary of State has created, that's him playing a game that requires responses like this. And yes, there's a great logic in that. Actually, what really needs to happen is proper funding for Northern Ireland on a recurrent, stable basis, then the local politicians taking responsibility, taking the decisions as to the choices between pay, everything else, service development, all those things need to be devolved and handled properly. The tactics are being played and manipulated here, which concerns me quite a lot.
Yeah. I think if people thought this was simple and easy to fix, the last 15 minutes has proven just how complicated it is. Thanks very much indeed for coming in to join us, and I suspect we may be talking to you again before too long. Now, coming up, we'll turn our thoughts to what the governance of this place might look like if Stormont doesn't come back anytime soon. But first to our series of voices from the front line, individuals from organisations helping those most in need. What are the challenges they're facing in the current political climate?
My name is Shauna Connor and I work with Action for Children. Action for Children is a children's charity who supports children, young people and their families. I have been working with Action for Children for 11.5 years now as a hub coordinator for the Fermanagh Early Intervention Family Support Hub. We have like 410 families and inquiries coming through at the minute. So we can have families that pick up the phone and ring in and just need a bit of support, or sometimes they don't know what they need, but they're ringing through to talk to somebody about how to access support. And it's my role to make them aware and to help them and visit them. In County Fermanagh we are very rural, so that brings itself a whole load of challenges in terms of access to support. Sometimes, you know, regional services don't come as far as Fermanagh. There's been an increase in families seeking financial support. For example, we had a particular family that came through looking for support. Their car broke down and needed to go through the MOT, and it was costing maybe about an £800 bill. We have families also coming through who don't have electric in the home. They haven't had money to be able to buy the essentials such as food, heating and electric. We need a restored local executive to start offering solutions to families who can't afford the essentials, and to invest in basic public and community-based services. And to choose not to is actively harming babies, children, young people and families. And we see the evidence of this every day at Action for Children.
My name is Eileen Murphy and I'm the Chief Executive of Women's Aid Armagh Down. And I've been doing this work for over 21 years. The services we provide begin with risk management, risk assessment, crisis planning, support planning, needs assessment. And last year alone, we provided these support services to over 1,300 women and 1,500 children and young people. Since COVID and definitely since 2020, the demand on our services has gone through the roof. We have a waiting list today that 10 years ago we would have been horrified at, to the extent that when we get a referral, we are now prioritising on risk. And when I say risk, I'm talking about risk of significant harm or homicide. But maybe those who aren't as high a risk of homicide, but have very high needs across the spectrum, have to wait far too long to get support. So we find ourselves in a desperate situation. It means that we're having to move women on out of support, perhaps before they're ready to move out, which in itself is an issue, because what we'll find is that they will just end up going back in again. Then people will come back to us in a worse state than when they left, and needing that help all over again. We need our politicians to really be there. Politicians know what they should be doing. They need to find a way to actively do it.
Eileen Murphy from Women's Aid and Shauna Connor from Action for Youth. And if you want to talk about how your organisation is dealing with the challenges of helping those most in need, you can email us on bbcpoliticsni@bbc.co.uk. Now, we're approaching the second anniversary of the doors shutting at Stormont. There are no signs the DUP is about to enable the restoration of power sharing. And yesterday, the Secretary of State ruled out both direct rule and joint authority. So what's left? What options are there for the running of Northern Ireland? And is there anyone out there who actually wants to do it? Let's discuss that with the commentators Newton Emerson and Chris Donnelly, and Andrew McCormick is still here as well. So, Newton, first of all, let's just tie these two things together. Will today's strike action have advanced the mission of the strikers one iota today, in your view?
No, I don't think that this is going to apply much pressure, because it was unclear who the strike was targeted at, and that is going to allow the Secretary of State and the DUP to get away in the smoke, I think.
And Carmel Gates, very interesting argument there about why she's not particularly criticising the DUP, and hopes that Jeffrey Donaldson might be able to hold out for a better deal from the Secretary of State before he ends his party's boycott of Stormont. Were you surprised to hear her saying that?
Well, there's a certain logic to it. I would like, put it this way,
it's not why Jeffrey Donaldson's not called the boycott off, is it, though?
I don't think so at all. But I'd like to believe if Jeffrey Donaldson does call that off, that if there was more money, then it would be a bonus. But I don't believe that is the genuine reason why Jeffrey Donaldson still hasn't made the call to return to Stormont.
Andrew, the DUP says the Secretary of State's using today's strike action as a way to pressurise the party into ending its boycott of Stormont. Would the threat of an enhanced rule for Dublin be a better stick to use? Because, of course, Ian Paisley said that's what worked on him back in 2007. I
recall the words of previous President Bush. That's not a threat. That's just the way it is. If there's any way to do this, it's going to involve something like direct rule with consultation with Dublin. That's what was there before 1998 under the Anglo-Irish Agreement. One of the reasons David Trimble went in 1999 was to supersede the Anglo-Irish Agreement and almost take control, get a role for unionism in North-South cooperation. Yeah. That was a gain for unionism.
But it's very complicated, isn't it? Because you hear a lot of people, whenever the phrase joint authority is bandied around, I think very inaccurately by some people, but you hear unionists, not necessarily the biggest fans of the Good Friday Agreement, saying if you look at the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, nowhere does it talk about joint authority, and any idea of an enhanced role for Dublin is minimal.
No, I think that's not the way I read the Good Friday Agreement. And actually, how we look at Plan B really has to be founded on the same principles. So the agreement says specifically no derogation of sovereignty. So joint authority is actually ruled out in the precise wording.
And again, Chris Eaton-Harris made that very clear.
That's very clear. However, if the institutions collapse, if Strand 1 and Strand 2 aren't working, then only Strand 3 is left. It talks about the British-Irish Intergovernmental Council or Conference taking responsibility for non-devolved matters. Now, that's open to interpretation, but what the previous practice between 02 and 07, that meant that came back, and the only way unionists can prevent there being a stronger role for the Irish government in relation to Northern Ireland is by going in and making the Strand 1 and Strand 2 institutions work. Otherwise, how can there be parity of esteem? How can the principles underlying the Good Friday Agreement stand? Parity of esteem, equality of treatment, balance, so it's not a partisan. The problem is that the problem with Stormont before 1972 was it was a partisan parliament. The only way to get past that is to have something that, in the absence of inclusive government, which is not possible while the DUP stay out, then you need something else that shows parity of esteem.
So what do you make of that? It's not a threat, it's just the way it is. If we don't have Stormont and we don't have direct rule, we will not have joint authority, but there will be an enhanced role, inevitably, for Dublin.
So the question is, why didn't we get that over the last two collapses? Why didn't we have a return to the Good Friday Agreement form of direct rule with...
Because presumably there was always a prospect of Stormont coming back, which apparently now looks increasingly unlikely.
No, those weren't the reasons. There were two specific reasons, particular to the collapse from 2017. Sinn Féin didn't want to be blamed for just handing power back to London, so it brought back the document from the St Andrews Agreement that said both governments would engage in joint stewardship of the process, and created this idea that that meant a form of joint authority. Then, 6 months later, the DUP was in a confidence and supply agreement with the Tories, so there genuinely would have been a problem, a political problem, with direct rule. And combined with the toxicity of Brexit, nationalism and the Irish government bought into this idea that there couldn't be a return to what they called British-only direct rule. Now, all those arguments are completely redundant. They don't apply to this collapse. They certainly don't apply anymore. And so that's the problem. We need to move past that weird collapse from 2017 and the strange arguments that led to this ridiculous limbo of indirect rule. If Stormont isn't going to come back, we need to recognise those arguments are redundant and move back to the default position, direct rule with enhanced Dublin input.
And should unionists be worried at that prospect?
Well, how worried were unionists between 2002 and 2007? That's the state we'd be back to. It's really interesting to hear a reference to the Anglo-Irish Agreement as well. A unionist brought Northern Ireland to a standstill for a year over that, and yet when the Merryfield Secretariat was set up, nobody noticed it. It still apparently exists in some kind of form all these years later. Everyone's completely oblivious to it. So what was the fuss about?
Chris?
I think the irony of all this is that those who have most to lose from us all having to consider an alternative to Stormont are those who are refusing to go back in. It's unionists. I think David Stirling, former head of Northern Ireland Civil Service, tweeted about that tonight.
He did.
He said unionists will regret the most if Stormont does not come up and running. And I take the point what Newt's making there, but I think it's also the case that people thought, the governments as well, that moving to another model would be giving up on a chance of resurrecting Stormont. If we truly are at the point of saying, look, Stormont is gone, then we are talking about an enhanced role for the Irish government. And what does that potentially mean a year down the line? An enhanced role for a Mary Lou MacDonald-led Irish government. Now, at that point, where does that leave unionism? in a very difficult position. Because at that point they're arguing to go back to Stormont, they're arguing to say, let's move away from Mary Lou McDonald having the role to put Michelle O'Neill in. Why did you not bother to do it now? So I think there's an irony in all this that whilst people are getting increasingly depressed about the prospects, I actually think there's a window here still. Jeffrey Donaldson could have moved before Christmas. British government clearly thought he was going to move, which is why they said, look, the talking's over, money's on the table. We're not moving on the leverage we have over a public sector pay. They clearly believe there's still a chance, because the logic of all this is Jeffrey Donaldson, if he doesn't do now, is making a real mistake.
You know,
Well,
there is another irony about that, of course, that if we do get into that scenario, it will be the mirror image of when the DUP was in bed with the Tories in Westminster after 2017. It would be not a technical breach of the agreement in any way, but would make it politically impossible. And then we might be back into some kind of form of indirect rule. But until then, we should just be aiming to resurrect the direct rule form that existed after 2002.
I mean, there is an argument, of course, that Jeffrey Donaldson, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but we hear it a lot, that Jeffrey Donaldson does want to go back in. The difficulty is he's having, frustrations managing his own party. And I think we characterised it last week by saying that the DUP is now effectively negotiating with itself. Jeffrey Donaldson's deciding if he can make a decision. I wanted to ask you just briefly about that David Stirling tweet that was referred to there. Former head of the Civil Service, David Stirling, and he tweeted today, despite the bright sunshine, there's a sad end of days feel in the air at Stormont. He said he can't help thinking if the Assembly has met for the last time, it will be unionists who come to regret it the most. Now, there'll be some unionists who'll say there is the Liberal elite trying to put pressure on us again and force us into a position we don't want to go into, and they'll dig in.
That's the fear. I totally agree with David. I think it's important to see what is in unionists' interests, and I come from a unionist background. The interest is in stabilising a union. That's not going to happen without other people supporting it. You can have the union on unionist-only terms, or you can have the union on agreed terms. And the terms agreed in the Good Friday Agreement have 4 things that are different from anywhere else in the UK and make it unique. Power sharing, North-South cooperation, commitments to equality, and the fact that the union is conditional. That's the mirror image of the principle of consent. It's the union stands as long as the majority support it. So, therefore, the best thing to do is to maximise the chance of the majority supporting it.
OK. Newton, I want you to comment on this, because it's not just nationalists and Republicans who are discussing an enhanced rule for Dublin. Lord Alderdice, the former Alliance leader, talked to me about what he called de facto joint authority on this programme just a few weeks ago.
And what did he mean by that?
Well, let's see. Let's see what he had to say
there's
first.
going to be some legislative change or constitutional change in a legal way. But of course, anybody who knows anything about the British Constitution knows that an awful lot of it happens by convention, by practice, by changing of arrangements. And that's the kind of thing that I've been speaking about and trying to encourage people to recognise. Nobody can seriously look at the way Northern Ireland is governed now and think that it's the same, with the same attitudes, the same culture, the same consultations, the same influences as was the case 25 years ago. It has evolved and changed, as these things do.
Lord Alderdice is a little bit constitutionally confused there. It's true that the British Constitution does evolve in that way in almost all regards, but we uniquely have a written constitution, a mini-constitution in the Good Friday Agreement, which would restrict how that evolution could take place. And if it got beyond the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, we'd have to renegotiate it. So it isn't something that would happen by accident. It could certainly happen, but we wouldn't just drift into it. We would have to get to a point where we would negotiate it, and we very well might do so. But he's misunderstood how it would operate there.
OK. Well, I'm sure he'd be very happy to have a detailed conversation with you and persuade you that he's right and you're wrong, but I'll leave that to the two of you to sort out. I wanted to ask you about Labour. We're trying to work out what might happen next and how this might be resolved. And you've said you think that the DUP might yet actually decide to end its boycott. Do you think there is an argument that makes sense for the DUP to do nothing at the moment, to wait for a general election and to hope that it manages to get a better deal out of a Keir Starmer-led administration in Downing Street than it will ever get out of a Rishi Sunak administration?
I don't think that's the primary factor. As I alluded to earlier, thinking in terms of logic, there's a window here that Jeffrey Donaldson has. It's really the best it's going to get. But I believe all along there has been something else at play. There has been a sense within unionism. It's just not just a reaction to Brexit and how the nightmare of how that's unfolded. The DUP supported Brexit. It's also, you know, the pulling the institutions down, in a sense, for the DUP was a blunt instrument, attempted to stop things. They are unhappy with how this society has changed. And in a blunt way, trying to pull the institutions down was saying stop on that. But unfortunately, things are changing all around them. They cannot change. The opposition, even more recently, to the Casement Park getting built. It's going to get built. They were opposed to Irish language legislation. That's happened, and councils will push that even further. They're not going to be too happy about institutions coming back and Michelle O'Neill being the first minister.
If that's right, that's never going to change.
No, it's not.
Because that's a mindset.
And that's exactly the difficulty within unionism, that it needs to be at the leadership to say, we can't control these things. Northern Ireland's a divided society. There are people making arguments for constitutional change. That's only going to grow. Demographically, we see it in elections. That argument is being made and it's becoming more pronounced. So at some point, someone like Jeffrey Donaldson needs to stand up and say, look, we can't control those things. What we can do is what Andrew was talking about. If you're interested in articulating a case for the union, you got to make something work, and you got to show that it works, and it's got to work not just for your own people, as he might describe it, but for everyone here. So there, you know, it's where it's always been. It's that crossroads moment for unionism. But once again, Jeffrey, I believe, he's only a short window, because this doesn't happen in the next few weeks. The labour disputes, the strikes, there could be another dynamic where there's a sharper focus on the DUP, and they wouldn't want to perhaps act and respond under specific pressure.
How much of that can you agree with?
An awful lot, an awful lot. This all goes back to the way that Brexit was handled and the way that the Johnson government sold the DUP the Brooklyn Bridge. So my criticism, I've criticised the British government a lot because they led the DUP up a garden path, and the DUP shouldn't have bought into that. They should have realised that what they're being told was not true and could not possibly be true.
All of that, and that's very interesting. All of that is in the past. The question is, how do we move forward from where we are?
So they need to. One thing is, people need to realise that and move on from it and stop pretending that you can have your cake and eat it. That's all gone. And
you think you could persuade Jim Allister of that?
No,
you could persuade Sammy Wilson, Nigel Dodds?
George Mitchell said in April, there will be some who will not be persuadable. But you've got to move on.
100%ers.
Exactly. We have to move on. And that's what David Trimble tried to do. And that was the right thing to do in that context. The right thing to do now is to move on. Realise that what's on offer, what's available. Because Jeffrey Donaldson always says this. He says, we have to have a settlement that the Unionists and Nationalists can both agree. He leaves out the fact that it also has to be agreed by the EU, the UK government, and the Conservative Party. Theresa May's deal only got 3 out of those 5. The Windsor Framework has 4 out of those 5, and the unions are the smallest of those 5.
OK, 20 seconds. How does Jeffrey Donaldson deal with those 100%ers in the DUP and around him?
If he's going to go back to Stormont, and I think it probably still is more likely than not, then he's just going to have to face them down in the end. And there's no choice in that. He's reached his Jeffrey Donaldson moment, as David Trimble might have called it, I suppose.
OK, Jeffrey Donaldson's David Trimble moment. We need to leave it there, folks. Thanks all very much indeed. Fascinating stuff. That's it for tonight. If you want to hear more about the political challenges this place is facing and how they might be dealt with, take a listen to the latest edition of our Red Lines podcast on BBC Sounds. I'll be back at the weekend with Sunday Politics, of course, at the usual time of 10 o'clock on BBC One. But for now, from everyone in the team, thanks for watching. Have a good night from all of us. Bye-bye.